What's it? Is it working? Is there a switch to turn it on? Huh? That's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It should say the word record though.
Yeah.
There's like. That's Steve Moss. Steve, okay. We got it. Okay, they wanted to take the place away, but I talked to them to continue. There's a new management here. The new manager will be speaking in November. Nice fellow, actually. All right. The room we're in is the main lecture hall of the religious Zionist movement. And the rabbis whose pictures are scattered around the room are the founders of religious Zionism. People of both Torah and the world who saw the Zionist enterprise as the beginning of God's redemption of man. That God is a Zionist, one who believes that the Jews should live in Israel and that they should control the state of Israel. Because if they don't control it, they can't live in it. One doesn't have to ideologically believe the Jews can control it, or should. It's a necessity. Otherwise we get killed, we can't live here. So it doesn't reach the stage of ideology. It stays at the stage of necessity. And to save our lives, we're certainly entitled to have a state of army. And it is that situation. The Arabs would simply kill us, as they did in the 20s and 30s in Hebron and Jerusalem and so forth. So these are the men who had the vision, men of deep Torah scholarship and piety, to see God's hand in the seemingly secular Zionist movement. And sometimes the people who seem most secular, somewhere way down deep are the most religious, because they have the faith that God will help them pull this off. And around the turn of the century, when there was no Jewish farming or government or army or language even, to think you could come to the malaria and Arab-infested Middle East and set up a Jewish state after 1900 years, and people would leave all the rest of the world to come here, was sheer insanity, except from a religious belief, albeit unconscious, that somehow, if we really make an effort, the time has come, and God would help us. And it worked. And other rabbis, perhaps very pious and learned, who stayed in Europe, took their families and congregations with them to the guest room. So Reb Soloveitchik said at this point in history, it's quite clear who was right. And they would have admitted it that they were wrong. He knew these rabbis. But their pupils still insisted they were right when they could see with their own eyes they were wrong. And the instance that happened yesterday on Shabbat Bereshit, where crowds of Haredi attempted on the Holy Shabbat to stone cars of fellow Jews driving along the road, being Mechalel Shabbat far more than the drivers, making a huge rumpus and wounding people and fighting with police and causing photographers to come out and extra policemen to have to work on Shabbat. There, in my opinion, could be no bigger Chilul Shabbat than their demonstration. Now, it's one thing if they would protest a street going through their neighborhoods on Shabbat, because that would mean that children could safely play and walk, but if it's adjacent, that's not the same as through. So you hear a bit of noise from the highway. Anyone who's ever lived near a highway knows that after a little while you just get used to it. And certainly the volume of traffic on Shabbat would be not much. So they may want to disagree with it, they may want to protest it, but to throw stones and start fights on Shabbos is the opposite of what they pretend they're doing. And I wrote 2 letters now to the Postman in Jerusalem, which I'll read to you, and then we'll get on to our subject. But this is current important news. Pirkei Avot, the only route to Route 1. Beautiful is the study of Torah with the way of the earth. For the pursuit of both keeps sinful thoughts from arising. While any Torah study, not accompanied by work, must fail in the end and lead to sin. Pirkei Avot, chapter 2, paragraph 2. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch defines the term the way of the earth, which is supposed to accompany the study of Torah for it to be beautiful. This term refers to earning a livelihood and to the social order, as well as to the mores of courtesy and propriety arising from social living, including good breeding and general education. Rav Shimshon Fowler. So Rav Hirsch says, in order for Torah study to be beautiful, according to the Talmud, it must be accompanied by good civil behavior, politeness, general education, good manners, and having a good livelihood. How sad to see this mission come alive, ignored, in the ugly Haredi riots depicted on the front page of the Jerusalem Post this morning. These frustrated, angry young men are products of a society which ignores two major mitzvahs: training youths to practice good professions, to support their families with dignity, and to be part of their country and its army. These are two basic mitzvahs. Do not separate from the tzibur, and a man must teach his son or have him taught some sort of profession, send him to a school, not just to learn Torah, but to learn a profession. And it just occurred to me, when we do that, who are we copying? When we teach our sons a profession and the Torah, whose example are we copying? What happens? It's a fetus soul, a little fetus in the womb. Does anyone remember what the Medrash says? Does someone visit the fetus in the womb?
No, but then we have a tradition that the fetus knows Torah.
How's he know it? How's he know it? Forgets it afterwards. How's he know it? What's the process? Anyone know? According to the Midrashim, God sends an angel to teach every fetus, it doesn't say Jewish, every fetus the Torah. And this they will quote in yeshivas, but they leave out the second part, and to show him the whole world. Okay. So God himself in the womb acquaints man with the whole Torah and with all of his reality, nature, and the nature of the world, and so forth. Later, when he's born, the angel gives him a knock, and a conscious recollection of it disappears, but a residual memory bank is still there, which is why man relates to everything in the world, because he's been taught all about it. We relate to the mating patterns of bats and to the orbits of stars, and we can understand them and manipulate them and so forth, because somewhere within us is that pattern. Okay? So, these young men are products of a society which ignores these two major mitzvahs of giving your son a good profession and having him be part of the community within which he lives. Then, Pirkei Avot says, in chapter 4, paragraph 2, Avera goreret Avera. One sin causes another. So what happens because of this sin of the young men not being in the army and not really being part of their country and not having a decent way to earn a living? What happens to them inside? They get angry, frustrated, tense. Because at some level of their being, not consciously, they're right with it. They're good Mesharmims. But at some unconscious level of their beings, they sense that there's something grossly distorted and inadequate in their education and position in the world, in society, in the state of Israel. And they know that they have to depend on charity. Someone else has to buy them their home and provide for them, not their own work. And they don't do the mitzvah which the Rambam brings to support one's wife and family. The wife is not supposed to work to support you either while you learn Torah. So they lack all this. They have no way of doing it usually because they haven't been trained, haven't even graduated high school. And the other thing, when they see all the other boys fighting the Arabs, and they're only fighting each other or throwing stones at people driving on Shabbos, this is bound to produce grave inner conflict, anger, and frustration. And when one is unhappy with oneself, instead of rejecting the way of life, you try to fight your own inner tendency to leave it by fighting those who are leaving it. I can't do it, they won't do it. And you start stoning people who aren't keeping Shabbos. The best sign that you're not happy keeping Shabbos is that you stone those people who are not. But you're in a situation where there's nothing else you can do. You feel stuck in it, so that you stay there. Okay? So their pent-up rage and frustration at the narrow lifestyle in which they're trapped leads to two other major sins. Profanation of both God's name and the Sabbath by their violent name of the conduct, In trying to stone their fellow Jews, they ignore another basic Jewish norm. Hillel says, be of Aaron's pupils, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving God's creatures and drawing them nearer to Torah. Pirkei Avot 1:12. Unfortunately, our protesting black brethren just turn everyone off. Torah true Jews and our alleged chief rabbis must be the first to denounce their horrible conduct. That's one letter to the Jerusalem folks. If it doesn't get in, at least somebody heard it. Now, to the in Jerusalem, on behalf of God's holy Torah, holy Sabbath, and holy city, I protest the terrible desecration of all three by violent charedim last Shabbat. If they really love Shabbat, they would celebrate it in joy and holiness in their homes and synagogues, rather than shouting, screaming, and attacking police in the streets. If they really cared about their fellow Jews, they give flowers and food to the motorists on Route 1, invite them to their homes for a Shabbat experience. By stoning, cursing, and declaring war upon unfortunate captives of a secular zeitgeist, God's self-appointed policemen only drive them farther from Torah, expressing their own inner frustration. How tragic that they scorn the Netziv's introduction of Bereshit on Shabbat creation itself. Does everyone know who the Netziv is? The Netziv of Tali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin was one of the greatest Torah scholars of the last days. His son, Rabbi Bar Ilan, was one of the founders of religious Zionism. And Bar Ilan University is named for him. Okay. It could be the Netziv's picture somewhere here too at the moment. I don't see it. So he wrote a commentary on the Torah, very famous commentary, and he wrote an introduction to Bereshit, and I'll quote from part of it. And it was Shabbat Bereshit where they did this. The patriarchs, the heroes of Bereshit. We quickly skip over creation, all that not so important stuff to get to who's going to marry Yitzchak. The patriarchs accustomed themselves to deal positively with others, to perpetuate creation. Even idolaters were treated with love and concern by them. There is truly much to be learned from the positive, peaceful manner in which the patriarchs approached life and accepted others, so vitally necessary to sustain the world. This is the principal idea of this book of creation. The source of the world's genesis and its continuity are the upright patriarchs, tolerant, an example to all humanity. They desire all creation to exist. A clear test of the alleged silent Haredi majority and our alleged religious leaders is whether they condemn the Shabbat violence in the name of God. Okay. So that's a bit of comment on the Shabbat events. Now, to the issue of male and female in the Bible. We read yesterday the book of Genesis. It's important to note that it's not so important in God's eyes. God gives less space to the entire creation of the universe than he gives to Eliezer's finding a wife for Yitzchak. Because if the right wife is found for Yitzchak, apparently he'll be able to do his mission. And apparently his mission is essential to the world. And that's far more, if he doesn't have the right wife, it's not going to happen. So somehow, in the very structure of Genesis, occurred to me today, we see the importance of a man having the right wife. Now let's go back to the story of creation. God creates everything in the world. What blessing does he give to the plants and fish and animals and so forth? What's the basic blessing? To increase, peru or vu. 2 words, peru or vu. Peru is probably like perot, to have a lot. But sometimes you can have a lot and they're not so hot. So therefore God also says, or vu, make them great. There's 2 phrases here. It's not enough to have kids, you have to raise kids. Right? And one of our prayers is Shalom Nigad Larik. We shouldn't strain and struggle with nothing coming out of it. But lo lay, and we shouldn't give birth to a good future. When we say a blessing, or a banim levanecha, you should seek children to your children, you should seek grandparents, peace upon Israel. Sometimes people unfortunately see the grandchildren and throw up. The grandchild is not exactly Yiddish nachas. By the way, I heard in the name of one of the Rebbeim where that term Yiddish nachas came from. Why not just say have nachas, pleasure, comfort from your children? Why say Yiddish or Jewish nachas? Because Asa, the bad guy, has a son. You know what the son's name is? Nachas. So if you ask someone to have nachas, it may be reminded of having a son like Asa for that, so they should have Jewish nachas. Okay, that's a side issue. But anyway, the blessing is you should be fruitful and your children should grow and be strong and powerful and great and fine and so forth. Is there a difference? Is there an extra phrase thrown in by the creation of man in the first story, which is Genesis 1:27, I believe? Does God add something? And God created man in his image, from dust of the earth and all that. And he said to him, be fruitful and fill the earth. Is there another phrase thrown in? What? Here. Ah, very good. We Jews are good Talmudists, but when it comes to the Bible, we got to have a Noahide. They know the Bible. Male and female, he created. Rav Hirsch points out that's at least said by human beings. So apparently, there being male and female again is very significant to the very creation of human beings, whereby animals is just the means by which they reproduce. So the Torah doesn't even mention it. It says reproduce, and we're already in this world, we know what God means. Whereas by man, he says specifically, male and female, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And that expression from Genesis 1:27 is repeated in Genesis 5, when the story is told again. We'll forget Genesis 2 for the moment. So Rav Hirsch says, he says male and female to teach you that you can only have a divine image if male and female are together. Both are created in God's image, and you can only have a complete image if you have male and female. That's Rav Hirsch. And the rabbis say, indeed, that a man without a woman lacks joy, lacks blessing, lacks everything. And some even say he lacks God. They don't say the same by the woman. Interesting. And a woman, she's also a half. A woman has no legal obligation to marry into this. A man does. And there seems to be a contradiction in the Talmudic stories, or Talmudic sayings. One saying is, why does the man pursue the woman and not the woman the man? Well, if you lose your wallet doesn't come chasing after you, you chase after your wallet. So since the woman was taken from the side of the man, he senses he's lost something, and he pursued it. Very nice. Another Talmudic passage says, more than the man wants to marry, the woman wants to be married. Now, on the surface, that's a contradiction. One implies it's the woman who wants it more, and one implies it's the man who feels inadequate, lost. You could say it's a contradiction. Some of our co-religionists say, Chazal say, as though all the rabbis say the same thing. The same way they disagree on many ritual points. They disagree on many life issues too, probably. However, in this case, I don't think we have to say that, and I will try to reconcile. Now, this is all very nice, but we have another story of the creation of man. Where's that? I quote you Genesis 1:27, and Genesis 5. This is the book of Total Tadam, the history of man. Where else? Genesis 2. Genesis 2 seems to give a different story. Not that God created male and female together, as Genesis 1 and 5 would imply, but he only created male. And then, when the male was lonely and didn't find the animals good enough company, God created woman by taking out a side of man, and they said, this is it. This is woman of my flesh. soul, this is my soulmate. Very nice. The only problem is, it seems to contradict Genesis 1 and 5. Can anyone think of a way to resolve the contradiction? In one place it seems to say God created man and woman together. And in the other place, it says that God created woman after man.
There's that story about being created after man.
Right, Ruth. So the Medrash says, and my friend Rabbi Aryeh Spiro says you can't explain all of Genesis without this Medrash. All of Genesis revolves around this concept, that in the image of God he created him, one person. Male and female he created them, that within that one person were two people. As many parts of nature, which contain both the male and female sexual components. So man originally was sort of like a Siamese twin, with one side male and one side female, which means basically, what religious and psychological meaning does that have? Besides the biological interest, or the anthropological interest, or the historical interest, what great consequences does that have religiously and psychologically? You're self-sufficient. It's a self-sufficient entity by itself. There's only one entity that's really self-sufficient. What's that? God. So God says it's not good for man to be alone. According to the way I'm explaining it, doesn't mean alone, but self-sufficient. Only God is ultimately a self-sufficient being. And therefore, I'll cut it in half, and one half will somehow have to relate to the other. There'll be a job, a task. And then, man can never feel completely self-sufficient. He'll feel in need of God. Why? Because no human bond is permanent. That's something else from salvation wrote about. That husband, wife, parent, child, no bond is ultimate. Because people die, get sick, get poor, get separated. And you just can't do it, even though you want to. Even your father or mother have to abandon you sometime. And that's what we say. Ki avi v'imi yazvuni, though my father and mother abandon me, Hashem Yaspeni, God will take me in. So man's only ultimate relationship is to be with God. And therefore, he can't be a self-contained entity. So God, for this great religious and psychological need, splits him up. Originally, he makes them together, which could be very nice to read first, to show they're equal and both necessary to make the divine image. But afterwards, they can't stay that way. Let's go back a verse. Genesis 1:26. Elohim says, Na'aseh adam b'tzameinu b'tenu, let us make man in our image, and he should rule over all the creatures. The big question, of course, is, who's we? Who's God talking to? Is he talking to himself? Not likely. So God says, let us, not us say, first person, plural. Let us make man in our image. Who's the our?
Oh, well, I heard it. I thought it was using the word simplification. I read yesterday that he's speaking to the components that are needed to create this.
Who are the components? What are the components? The blood and the nerves and the feet. That's interesting. The only problem with that one I never did hear. I don't like it, and I'll tell you why. If it's the eyes and nose and ears and so forth, and blood vessels, they don't have neshamot or personalities. They're meaningless individually. They're only meaningful when they get together. So I wouldn't like that one. That's where you get that one from. Huh?
Rabbinic interpretation.
Right. Where did you read it? I know where you read it. Rashi. There's when people all say something, and they don't remember where they got it from. For better or for worse, we're living in a Rashi culture. It doesn't have to be that way. It could be an Abarbanel culture. If it was a culture that studied the Torah with Abarbanel rather than Rashi, it would be quite a different society. Quite different. Because he's quite a different person than Rashi in his approach and ideas. Or a Ramban culture. But we live in a Rashi culture from Eastern Europe anyway. So Rashi says God addresses the angels. Why does he do this? Why not make man directly? Why involve the angels?
He's self-sufficient.
Right, God is self-sufficient. So that's again exactly the same message according to the second part of Rashi. According to the first part, the angels don't like the creation of man. They want to be God's only agents. Man's something low, that someone as low as man should know God. The angels are very unhappy about it. So what do you do with the bad kid who makes all the trouble in school? You make him a leader. Instead of being a leader for bad, you make him a leader for good. So the angels are protesting, so God takes them in on it. Let us make man. So the first message in Rashi is that God is setting an example for man. He doesn't have to do anything. But he's setting an example to co-opt those who disagree with you, try to take them into your establishment rather than fighting them or rejecting them, which is certainly a message for the guys who spend their Shabbos on the remote road, on Route 1. That's not the way to get to 1. The second message of Rashi is also very interesting, that God, who doesn't need to consult with anyone, consults with the angels to set an example for man, that even I consult, you consult too. Marba Eitza Marba Tabunan, the more advice, the more wisdom. So the more you consult, the better it is. So God consults with the angels to show man he should consult. Very nice. The Ramban, not Maimonides, has quite different interpretation. His is that God's addressing the whole creation, which does have souls and brains. The animals, the birds, the fish, the plants. Everything he created up till now, he's introducing them. I want you to meet your new boss. Okay? The president of the company appoints a new chairman of the board, and he calls a meeting of all the employees and says, this is your new boss. So since man is to rule over the whole universe, God says we'll all make him in our image, in the sense that man contains all the universes I mentioned before. Within me is the ability to understand everything else in the universe and manipulate it and use it. But it's not a two-way progress. The fish can't psych me out, and like I can psych out the fish. The fish can't build a human aquarium like we build a fish aquarium, and so forth and so on. So let us make man in our image means that man is a microcosmos, that the macrocosmos of the entire universe is somehow contained within every human being, both in his physical structure according to the Kabbalah, which you don't have to accept. Kabbalah is not necessarily the Word of God, and that's part of the problem with these guys in Beit too. And but in a sense of intellectuality, we can understand it easily. That we, within our intellect, somehow have the capacity to fathom and understand the paths by which the very stars orbit and the animals mate and the plants grow and how chemistry works, physics is remarkable. So man is a microcosmos. Now, this has interesting significance for the capitalist crowd, because they believe in something called reincarnation. And some people actually say, oh, that's Judaism, reincarnation. Nonsense. The Kabbalah believes it, which means that all the Sfardim and all the Hasidim believe it, because they all accept the Ari, who all accepted the Kabbalah. But the great philosophers, Talmidei Chachama, probably much greater and earlier than the Ari, like Saadia Gaon and Albo of Sefer Yikarim, said this is nonsense, which the Jews picked up from the Goyim. We know that the Greeks and Indians and Egyptians believed in reincarnation. And the Saadia Gaon says it's nonsense. The most interesting approach is a Barbadas. He says, oh, it's true. Life doesn't make sense without reincarnation, because so many of people's lives make no sense. But, he says, I'm so glad that the Greeks discovered it. He views it as secular science. Whereas the Ari views it as holy writ, and the Sadducees views it as pagan nonsense. So those who believe in reincarnation, the Hasidim and company, so the way that Boston Rebbe explained it to me, since I am comprised of everything else in the world, let us make man in our image, literally. There's a bit of the cat in me, a bit of the bird, a bit of the cow, a bit of the fish. So if I fail to develop any one of those parts to its divine potential as an image of God, then you get back to go, like a monopoly. And that part returns to be its own natural self. So it's not that the whole of me is reincarnated in a cat, but the cat part of me is reincarnated in a cat. It's very interesting. It may be absolute nonsense, but it's quite interesting. Now, maybe it's true, but no. I tend to disbelieve it because the Talmud and Midrash don't mention it anywhere. And they speak all about the creation of the person, as I mentioned, the angel teaching and everything else. And they never mention it. So it's my hunch that this is not Jewish anyway. Whether it's true is a different question. I tend to doubt it. Okay, so now that's two interesting possibilities. So let us make man in our image. Anyone guess the third possibility, to whom God's talking? God could be talking to the angels. God could be talking to the rest of the universe. Ruth brought up an interesting idea to the parts of the body, though I found that one difficult. Maybe you'll ask lawyers, so ask my questions, see what they say. Is there another possibility to whom God's talking? Reb Soloveitchik said, God is talking to the man who he's about to create. Everything else in the universe, God says, let it be. Let there be light, let there be plants, let there be animals, let there be fish. In the case of man, God says, so to speak, to the potential man whom he's about to create, let us make man in our image. I will create you physically, but the divine image is something that you and I have to work on together. I will not do it for you. You will not be pre-programmed to achieve your destiny, as is everything else in the universe. The sun, the moon, and the stars work without anybody nagging them. They're right on schedule. They never mess up. The heavens declare the glory of God. There are no words, the Medrash says. God doesn't have to nag them and nudge them. They're pre-programmed. It's a deist, perhaps, kind of view. But man always has free will to choose between good and bad, to develop his divine potential, or behemot, or to be like an animal. It's his choice. He needs God's help. You and I will make it. That's what salvation is doing. So after God says that the image of God is something that you and I will develop together, he then says in the image of God he created him. Male and female, he created them. I submit to you that if we take that measure that were originally one, because it says he created him in the image of God. What God is then saying is, I don't want to give you anything essential to your divine image to develop, already developed, pre-programmed. Anything essential to your divine image, you have to do for yourself with my help. Like a little kid teaching him to walk or ride a bicycle. You help him, but he's got to do it, climb the steps. So God splits off the woman then and says to man, now you have to make that union, which biologically was originally pre-programmed like everything else in the universe. And Rav Hirsch so explains the laws of incest. I shall not make my sister my wife, but I shall make my wife my sister my bride, and so on and so on. God doesn't want you to take a naturally existing relationship and just add biological sex and children to it, but to make the divine human relationship between two people by yourself with God's help. Okay. So that would explain very nicely, again, why the male-female component is stressed in the creation of the divine image of man specifically. Because God wants that divine image to be developed by man, and since the male-female is so crucial a part of it, so God wants that too to be developed by man. Now, I will just go on then to try to define what are these two halves. They are not identical. what is the nature of the male half and what is the nature of the female half. I might take a seemingly bizarre interpretation as a takeoff point. Can you think of another way to interpret, in the image of God he created him, male and female he created them? The way I suggested, it's one being which had two sides to it, and then God split it up in chapter 2. Is just another interpretation of the image of God he created him. Only him. He created only Adam. There was only a male. And later he takes part of it and makes it to a female. Now that part he takes out, probably also image of God, because it comes from the image of God. And the halacha, the law, certainly indicates that a woman is an image of God too. If one kills a woman, he's obligated to the death penalty just as much as for a man. You have to let yourself be killed rather than killing a woman the same as a man. So halachically, you are allowed to kill animals. So halachically, it's quite clear the woman is on that status. Yeah.
I read exactly Friday, this Friday, article. I forgot by who.
In your Jerusalem magazine?
What it says, the women generally has more bina.
Right.
And why? Because it's written, Barna, etc.
By even, that's
Bill, etc.
And that's a takeoff on a concept that woman has more intuitive understanding, bina, than man. That was in Rev. Riskin's column.
Yeah.
Mine was in your Jerusalem.
And he emphasized why, because he said, he didn't make it etc., but he built etc.
Built. All right. But the problem still remains. According to the Abarbanel, only the male is so holy. And the woman is just to help and propagate. Yeah. That's what the Abarbanel says. Now, as I point out to you, A, it doesn't make sense. B, it's against all the halacha. So let's try to understand it. Now, Abarbanel can be a takeoff point for understanding. A strange notion that it's only the male who's the image of the Lord. That's what he says. I told the Chamalabelist, the great Bible teacher, about this. She said to me, no. I said, yes. And I brought her the Abarbanel. And she looked and looked and looked. And I said, no. She said, don't tell anyone. But since I'm not that beautiful, I don't have to listen to her. So I'll tell you. And then I asked great rabbis, what do you do with this Abarbanel? What was very interesting is most great rabbis have ever heard of. The one lady, I think it's Rivka Horowitz, who teaches at Hebrew University, Hasidut, she was familiar with it, but didn't know what to do with it. Yitzchak Ginsburg, the capitalist from Kfar Chabad, said, of course. She's not an image of Elohim, because Elohim is nothing very important. Careful. There's two major names for God used throughout the Bible, and most distinctively in Bereshit. One is Elohim, the other is Hashem. In the creation story of chapter 1, the name Hashem does not occur. Just the name Elohim. And a hint as to the idea is that Elohim, in its numerical equivalent, in its gematria, is 86, which is the same as the Hebrew word hateva, nature. So God, as he appears in Genesis 1, is not the God of infinity and love and intangibility, but the God is perceived through the manifold manifest laws of nature, which have no feelings. They're laws, arbitrary laws based on abstractions. We understand the laws of nature not through emotion, not through love, not through relating to the infinite, but simply by abstracting principles from our observations, what we call the scientific method. Man, the male, has that part of God when God splits them up. So the Abarbanel is saying, according to Rev. Ginsburg, now there's a bit of a male in every female, and a bit of female in every male. Otherwise you couldn't explain my having breasts. No scientist can explain it, in my opinion. Theologically, it's very simple. God's telling you a message. Everything in the world is a message. It's especially man's body, image of God. So God's telling me there's a little bit of a nurturer in me. I'm not a woman, a little bit. And the same vice versa in the female body structure. It's a little bit of a male and female. And the message is then that the male's thing is conquest. Originally, both are told to conquer the earth, which would fit nicely that idea they were one. But after the split up, only the male is involved in conquest. And the woman is involved in nurturing. Not necessarily having babies, but nurturing. The mother of all flesh, of all life. Not necessarily of her own children. God will make some do something. So we then seem to be coming to a definition that masculinity, or the male half of the divine image, let's call it, is that part of God which is restricted, to use the term of the Kabbalists. I like this part of Kabbalah, it makes great sense to me. What they call tzimtzum. God restricted himself in order that the world should emerge of rigid laws which don't seem to change for tzaddik or Russia or anyone. It's a cold, impersonal, magnificent, glorious God of nature, Elohim. The woman's half, according to Reb Ginsburg, is God's essence. Not God's abstraction and limitation and impersonal laws, but God's essence, which is infinite, loving, and all-encompassing. And what is the bracha the woman says in the morning? She'asani kirtzono, at least since the 14th century or so. That he has made me like his own personality. Kamo haratzon shelo.
Life is sweet. Life is sweet.
Well, yeah, will or personality, that I call it God's essence, but not in accordance with life. That's the important thing. And none of the blessings in the morning are acceptance of faith or dianemis. We say, Pokeach Ivrim, God opens the eyes of the blind person doesn't say, Shasani Kirtzono. When everyone else says, okay, Kafufi, the lame person doesn't say, Shasani Kirtzono. So if at some point in history along comes a blessing for the woman, we assume it's joy and praise to God for something good. And that all fits together very nicely. The woman doesn't need the formal discipline of so many laws and mitzvahs and learning and Gemara, because she doesn't have to build this. She's made like it. And these two aspects of God, the Ein Sof, the God of infinity and love, and the God of Tzimtzum, of the laws of nature, and perhaps a lot of the laws of the Torah, these are reflected in the male and female halves. Then we could well understand it's the male who would search for the female, because he's got the raw deal. He's got the less essential half of God, let's call it. So he needs the security and support, and that's why the Talmud does not say that a woman without a man is lost. No, she's not lost and helpless. She's got an inner strength and a holiness. And of course, the best proof that this is correct is that you can have Abraham for your father. If your mother is not Jewish, you're not Jewish, despite what the Reform claim today. And the other way around, if your mother is Jewish, the worst woman in the world, and she marries the biggest bum in the world, you're 100% Jewish. Because it's the mother who has this essence of soul of God. In the case of a Jewish mother who has the Torah's essence, the Jewish essence. So Reb Soloveitchik explained that the woman gives the child his essential soul, and then the man, the Elohim component, the Tselem Elohim, develops it and teaches us about the world and life and how to make a living and how to work with people and conquer and intellectual activity and army activity and so forth. It's very simple, actually, it comes out. And then after the split and the sin, what does Adam call his wife? Eve called Chava. She's called Chava because she's the mother of all life, the nurturer. That doesn't mean that she's 100% woman and Adam's 100% man. After that, we're all mixed up with Talmud says. We all have male and female components. But still there's a leitmotif. There's a way we educate boys, the way we educate girls. There's exceptions, but generally. And so this would explain very nicely how God, after the sin, gives each one a curse, a problem in their life task. He doesn't say Eve will have problems conquering the world, because that's not her main task. She may have a job, she may not. It doesn't define her essence. And she's not a failure if she doesn't have such a good job. But he says, thorns and thistles the earth will yield for you. It gets worse in Cain's time. Right? And to the woman he says, with difficulty will you bear and raise children. Tell me one in this both. So the woman who's a nurturer finds nurturing is difficult, and the kids can be sassy and nasty and disappointing, and it's so hard. And the influences of the world mess them up when she's trying to build a Beit in her home, a holy sanctuary which will inspire her husband and children. And the man finds conquest, from the simplest conquest of animals and aliens to in warfare, to the conquest of science, the conquest of Talmud, and the conquest of philosophy. Man finds conquest full of thorns and thistles along his path after leaving the sanctuary of God environment. And that's the Eshet Chayil according to her verse. Eshet Chayil builds her house so that Nota Basharim Bala, the sheepdog Ziknei Aretz. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits with the elders. Not that he sits and learns while she runs the saloon, the horribly corrupt East European model. No, her verse says he has to go out and support his wife. But he's a leader of the community in business and Torah and everything. But he's different from the other guys. He's different from the other politicians. He's not crude, he's not vulgar, he's not crass, he's not materialistic. Why isn't he? Why does he have a higher nature? Because he's known in the gates as her husband. Because she is not so public and builds in her home a sanctuary of holiness, a Beit HaMikdash Ma'at in her house. So her husband and children go out into that world living. She has the greatest impact on the world, but it stays somewhat indirect, because otherwise if she's out there, she'll lose Kirsoma. She'll lose God's essence in the world of Elohim. Okay. So that's a bit on the essence. And therefore, which follows, the woman is the leader, and indeed Eve is the leader, but then God punishes her. The man, instead of listening to her, gets an impulse to dominate. And that wouldn't be so bad if she just tell him to go away, buzz off. But the problem is, she wants him. We'll pause for a moment while we change batteries. Yes. Well, there's tough kinds of knowledge. There can be both kinds of knowledge. There can be abstract knowledge and intuitive knowledge. Anyway, so the woman's problem is the man will tend to dominate because she used her domination to lead him astray instead of leading him on the way. Rav Hankin interprets, it is not good for man to be alone. Man can't be good alone. He needs his wife to help him make good, vice versa. That's Rav Hankin's interpretation. And then God creates woman right after giving the command not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because man can't do it alone. He needs someone outside to correct, Ezer Kenegdo, and so forth. So anyway, so her problem is he will now tend to dominate her. And she'll still want him and yearn for him, so she won't be able to leave him either. Okay, and then we see what happens. For the next 20 generations, woman has no role in the Bible except to accompany her husband and their children. We don't read of woman doing anything significant, this is my own observation, until 20 generations later when we come to Sarah. So besides Abraham and Sarah creating a people to bring everyone back to Eden, recreation. Yetziat Mitzrayim is the nation which does the same thing as Echel L'Maaseh Bereshit, Shalom V'Zlachar. That it recreates the kind of world that God wanted and needed to bring everyone else back to that world from the state of Israel. And elements of man's original experience, the Hebrew language, the Sabbath, the kosher law, certain fruit is drink, which the rest of mankind discards, suddenly Abraham's descendants develop in full. So I would add, to close, this idea that also the idea of woman's natural leadership as being Kiryat Sono is brought back by the matriarchs, by the followers. And Sarah suddenly, at crucial moments, does the same thing as Eve with Adam, talks Abraham out of what he wanted to do, to throw out Ishmael or whatever. And God says, listen to her. And at least at this point, after having Yitzchak, she's a greater prophet than Abraham, the rabbi said. And so, with Rivka, the next generation, she does the same thing. Yitzchak's idea is the idea of the society whose weaknesses and sicknesses we witnessed yesterday. The Yaakov should stay alert in the kollel, remain each time, Yoshev Ohalim. And the blessings of this world, blessings of woman, earth, and heaven, and rain, should go to Esau, who will give good donations to Yaakov. They even take master from the salt. And every year they'll have a black tie, red lentil dinner in honor of Esau. They'll give a big donation to Yaakov's yeshiva. But little Rivka, the Batshuva girl from Las Vegas, knows what happens to the world when the Yaakovs stay in the kollel and let the Esavs run the world. And that same Yaakov, who up to now was Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim, will change and go out in the world to the school of hard knocks, to Uncle Love. And when he comes back with Torah in Derech Eretz, Torah with all worldly development, brother Esav slinks away Mipnei Yaakov Achiv. And he understands that the Holy Land, which is to be the model land, which is to be Kibeh Shemayim Ha'aretz, to combine Torah and Derech Eretz, has to be developed by the descendants of Yaakov. And the next generation we see, again, Rachel and Leah taking leading roles and not being passive, almost manipulating Yaakov sometimes. And then finally, when the Jews become a people down in Egypt, who saves them under the apple tree? The Jewish wives who talk their husbands into having babies when their husbands have given up under the Egyptian oppression. And their mirrors with which they teased and flirted with their husbands become the plating for the altar of sacrifice, of bringing lower life up to higher. And it's Moshe's mother who saves him, of course, and his sister, and so forth. So we see that woman somehow is his better half, as I've interpreted, but abused it and lost it for a while. And each has a different aspect of God, both of which are essential to form perhaps a true image of God, or a true functioning being in this world. And how the matriarchs and their descendants, the Jewish women in every age, indeed, not only determine who is Jewish, but preserve the Jewish people for its redemptive mission as kingdom of priests and holy nation. Okay. So we did today something about women. Now maybe Ralph can tell us a little bit about the Nigerian experience for a few minutes, if you would. For your answer.
Yeah. Well, I want to cut it short. It's been a long experience, and I have it. I think I will be telling it at your establishment sometime soon. So I don't want to keep you too long.
10 minutes or so.
I was in North Africa during the war, and something hit me that put me out of use for military service. I was brought home to England, ready to be discharged. I was put into a military hospital, and I saw the ex-soldiers that were ready for discharge, and one I took particular notice of, because the other people wouldn't speak to him. They smoked him. He was a Jew. He was a Jew who had fought for our country, England, in the thousands. It was the Jewish brigade that entered Jerusalem under Yaakov. And in the thousands. Well, I got the pally with him, or friendly, whatever you like to say. And he didn't force his religion on me like Christians do. He simply told me the simple thing. And Rosh Hashanah came in 1942. And he had for Rosh Hashanah crowns to go. It was 5 men writing articles in 1842. But I didn't know that the Holocaust was going on then. So when we were discharged as a goodbye, he gave me that magazine, and I can bring it to he gave me that magazine, kept it, and still have it at home. And I kept it. I was a Christian, and I was going out to get people to believe in Jesus Christ as the Saviour of mankind. Well, I went on with that Christian work, and I promised God, when I was on guard duty in the forces, that if he ever brought me through where he's not, I would want to go and serve him full time. Well, the challenge came, and I was in trouble because I had a jolly good job. But I said it. Then, strangely, a mission society asked me if I'd go and do it. So I went into work, mission work, with the African and West Indian mission, the Indian Seamen's Mission and others. And I mixed up with down and outs. I slept in the lodging houses with them, and I got to know man in his hard times and in his good times. Well, I still had this Jewish young man's Rosh Hashanah, and I felt I liked this. And I joined up with a society which was really English, Christian English. But it was run by 3 ex-Jews who believed in the Christian Messiah and the Christian doctrine. Well, that didn't last long. I didn't like it. And so I started buying the Jerusalem Post. I miss what I got in Nigeria. And through the Jerusalem Post, I got in touch with Dr. Lehman, Rabbi Dr.
There?
Lehman, Lehrman.
Right.
He lived in Rehavia.
Right.
I visited him and had tea with him and all.
Rabbi Lehrman married myself, my wife.
Pardon?
We're very close to this.
Oh.
My mother-in-law was
And I met his wife too. So when I wanted to be converted to Judaism, they told me that all that I needed was to follow the code of Noah. And that's what I'm trying to do today. Well, on troop ship, going out up the coast, I was in Nigeria and along in the off the coast, west coast rather. On the trip, I saw how the English people treated the troops like animals, how they fed them, and that. I was disgusted. Well, I said, come on, we're going to meet on the top deck of this troop ship and start talking and praying and singing and that. And it was lovely. So that led on to other things. And we got through.
These were Nigerian troops.
Pardon?
These were Nigerian volunteers.
They were able people. I'll not keep you long, but here's the picture of them.
You got these Nigerian people interested in Judaism now. No one's
It tells you who they are. So they became my friends, and one of them is, and 2 or more of them are still there today. My friends, and one is the director of the Yokai movement in Ikaduru, Nigeria.
He writes us letters occasionally. How many people do they have, actually?
He tells me that they have 300.
Really?
But you could have thousands if I went into the press, because working for another society, I went into the press and putting advertisements for our literature in the magazine, in the press of Nigeria, the Nigerian Outlook and Nigerian Times, and they could not cope with the response. But I'm afraid of that because I can't tackle it.
They have the books.
Huh?
They have the books on nowadays.
They do have some, and I try to feed them with some knowledge, but that is where I want to, because I like your write-up on it, and I wrote to you, and I would like to see it being another part of the top Torah outreach program. through the Gentile level, because I believe that the Noahide laws
When you
were
became
designed to lead up to that.
when you became to Judaism,
Pardon?
when you came to Judaism, when?
What age did you get interested in Judaism?
I was late 30s.
How old are you now, Ralph?
The year 40.
I have to admit that I am 85 years.
No.
I've been coming to Israel for 20 years.
A lady came into our place a year or two ago, Veronica Cole, and she was very interested in Judaism. She had this feeling within that she had to join the Jewish people, learn about the Torah, that Christianity was wrong from Yorkshire, and we referred her to Ralph. And I understand she's become quite friendly with you and working together with you.
Yes, we do.
She's going to speak.
We don't
also.
exactly see eye to eye, and we've been working, but we were interrupted in the work. I was put into hospital because I had an infection. I'm healthy otherwise, but a lung infection they call it. And I was out for a time. So
you and Virginia, Veronica have been getting people interested in England through your Noahide Fellowship, right?
yes. The Noahidism is growing rapidly in America and in Nigeria, and it is to some small degree here in England growing. But I differ with the Americans because the exact, and this is controversial, but the exact definition of the nation of Israel, that they should become a kingdom of priests unto God. Now I've told this to Veronica, and I've explained it, and I think she's taken it up, and that. It doesn't say anything about monarchy. And of course we know 1 Samuel chapter 9, and those other things when the people wanted the monarchy. I've written an article on it, but that's controversial.
By the way, so you agree with the Barbadell that it's a bad thing to have a king, as opposed to my Bobbies who says we should have a king. There's two views.
Yes. You have dealt with that, yes, in your...
Right, partial sheets.
What is it?
There's two views on monarchy. The Torah says, if you will say, I want a king like all the other nations about me, place upon yourselves a king. Maimonides views that as a mitzvah, as a good thing to do. And the Abarbanel, based on 1 Samuel 8, says it's a concession to the people's weakness, like the man wanting to take a cheap pagan woman in warfare. And that's the Abarbanel. It's summarized in a book called My Parsha Sheets, and in a book called Meditations on the Torah and Parshat Shoftim, I think, by Jacobson. Thank you very much, and you should be with us for many years, God willing, and he should help you in your good work. And you're speaking this Thursday night, right, at 7. I had a double mitzvah before I could speak about Avodah Zarah. It just wouldn't be right otherwise. In dealing with idolatry, Avodah Zarah, let's for a moment start with the anthropology of religion. What does man start worshiping?
The sun,
The sun. Then what does he worship after that?
the stars.
Idols. So you would say first the sun and then the stars is the beginning of man's relation. And then the moon, then the idols. How does he get to God finally? By Abraham. All right? Would others say that the idols come first rather than the... Where does man start? The anthropology of religion would say perhaps that man starts with being in awe of natural forces. And then at some point he makes symbols, something more permanent and portable and fixable of those natural symbols. Plus the sun doesn't stay there. If you suddenly want to worship the sun at just 50, at midnight, there's no sun to worship. If you're a moon worshiper, you're stuck at 3 in the afternoon. So therefore, in a certain way, this idea just occurred to me. a picture or a statue is a better object of worship than any of these solar bodies. And indeed, this could give a theological explanation. Remember, the universe is God's audiovisual department. And we believe that the written text of Torah is supplemented by everything which our senses perceive. Each thing has a corresponding message. And perhaps, if one is only in the books and doesn't get the audiovisual division, he won't even understand the books. And let me give you an example. Once, I was at the beach in Boston, and a friend brought me a copy of Reb Soloveitchik's Lonely Man of Faith. And I read it. Fine. On Shabbos, I saw Reb Soloveitchik. I said, I got your Lonely Man of Faith this week. Someone brought it to me at the beach. Beach? I said, yeah, I understood why God wanted it that way. I started to read the book. And Reb Soloveitchik dwells there on the very painful task of man. Woman, we learned last week, has a very painful and difficult task, nurturing. Be it her own children or the world. You try to be good and raise something, and it's not so easy that often doesn't even have any gratitude when you raise. Man is given primarily the task of kibush, and conquest. And I would say the most difficult conquest of all, as difficult as the woman's burden of raising and bearing children, nurturing, is to try to find the truth, to learn. That's what learning is all about. What's it all about? That's what learning is. Both of the world and the Torah. And that task is depressing if you're honest about it. If you're not honest about learning, then you just accept whatever beliefs are around you, or you join a movement, whatever Reb Shach says is the truth, whatever Khomeini says is the truth, whatever Lubavitcher Rebbe says is the truth, whatever, whoever you happen to pick, Wahhabia square. So that's one way out. If you don't take that way out, and you really try to search for truth, you get lonely, first of all, because no two people see the truth the same. Followers see the truth the same, but not searchers. So what happens? You get lonely and sometimes sad and depressed because you're not sure you're right. You're not sure you're achieving anything. Everybody else is having a good time and you're going through all this inner angst and you don't know what's going to come from it. So it's a sad process. That's what Reb Soloveitchik writes about, the lonely man of faith. Then I told him, I read it for about 10 minutes. I empathized 100%. I began to feel the Weltschmerz. And I jumped in the water and I forgot all about it. So God creates the nice cool lake surrounded by a forest. And God creates also the task of learning the Torah. And if one partakes of everything, then it's not so terrible. So it could be, it occurred to me now, that God gives a message with everything in the world. And as I mentioned last week, that I have the vestiges of rest. They're not worth much for anything. Can't do anything. But it fits beautifully the message of creation. That the essence of woman is nurturing, the essence of man is conquering. And I have a little bit of a nurturer in me. God's telling me you should be 100% male chauvinist. It's not realistic. You have a bit of a female in you, and vice versa. So the same here. It could be by God not making any astral bodies normally visible permanently. He's automatically building a safeguard against the Avodah Zarah into the world. Because it's hard to worship something if it's not always available when you need it. God forbid you're sick and you're a sun worshiper, the sun isn't there. So then man contrives something which solves that problem. In other words, this always bothered me a little bit when I taught these things. Why should he go from the worship of nature, which is so impressive and awesome, to the worship of mere symbols of nature? The answer is because those are much more useful. You have them all the time. I mean, there's nothing like catching a fresh trout and roasting it over a fire. But for most people, you'd rather have it at the supermarket all the time, cleaned, ready to put in the oven. And you always have the trout. It's wonderful to dive deep into the sea and see God's wonders in your lives. But if you have a video of it, the chances it'll happen to you are far, far greater. So man contrives things so that he doesn't perhaps have to really make a lot of effort and get a genuine experience, and he makes pseudo experiences. Okay. So we got two possible views here. That man started out worshiping his pictures, which doesn't seem so likely. But better, he started out worshiping the natural bodies and gradually found a more efficient form of doing so. You couldn't make fun of him if he worshipped the sun, that you made the sun and you're worshiping it because he didn't make the sun. You couldn't make fun of him and say that that sun you're worshiping is a nothing. It has no effects because it has vast effects. Photosynthesis, the temperature of the earth. Nothing could exist without the exact positioning and radiation of the sun. It's not silly. Once it gets to worshiping the symbol and detaching the symbol from the reality, that's silly. Okay, I would say everything we said now is reasonably correct according to the anthropology of religion. According to the Torah, it's all nonsense. Why? Because Adam starts out with God. There's no worship of sun, there's no worship of anything else. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden have a close, intimate, speaking relationship with God. Something like Moshe's later Panim on Panim. So therefore, the Torah's version of the development of religion is exactly the opposite of what the secularists teach. The secularists teach that I see diversified forces in the world, and I think they're fighting each other. I don't see their overall unity. Finally, as man develops science, man develops abstract conceptualization, he gets the idea that this is all part of a oneness, and that there's a mastermind behind it. Till you get there, it's many, many generations. No, according to the Torah, not so. Man starts out with an intimate feeling for God and a relationship with God. And then man slowly walks away from it. Okay? For example, where in the opening chapters of Genesis do we see idolatry? Anyone recall? Who worships idols? Abraham comes and knocks down all the idols. Who worships idols before Abraham? Do you see that? Where do you see it? Yeshua. Do you know of any mention of Avodah Zarah in the early chapters of the Torah? I don't.
No.
Nowhere. It's all in Chazal. It's funny. Here's such a significant thing. It doesn't say they worshipped idols. On the contrary, we have Adam, Cain, Noah, Abel. Who do they worship? God. Right? The first war in history, the first murder, is Bel's versus Panas. They both have a religion. God seems to like one religion better. And the other guy kills his brother, the leader of his fellow faith, because God likes his religion better. Most interesting. Man sins first. The pleasure sin of Adam and Eve. Then, once he's sinned, he becomes religious and starts doing all kinds of korban things. And then comes hatred and aggression out of that. I don't know the exact psychosocial-dynamics, but I would suspect that sufficient thought would produce some interesting patterns. Okay, so we see Noah Avodah Zarah there. Noah comes out of the ark and makes sacrifices to God. We say all people perverted their way on the land in the Dor HaMabul, where Adam and Eve's sensuality sin goes wholesale. It's a franchise. And they wash themselves out. But in the text itself, anyway, it's moral corruption and violence. When the money runs out for drugs, the violence is an aftermath, and then God gets fed up. Nice people, maybe, just caught in the physical habit. No mention of idolatry. By the Tower of Babel, I would submit it's not an idolatrous civilization, but something else. What? It's certainly not a God-oriented civilization. Tower of Babel, though you don't see that so clear in the text either, but let's take the rabbi's word for it. That tower to the heaven is to rebel against heaven. They don't want God. But we don't see that they worship idols. What do they worship? Nothing. That's something else. There was the opposite of God worship, in my opinion, is not Avodah Zarah, a strange worship of God. But the opposite of idol worship is no worship. Where man feels self-sufficient. Now that's sort of stupid. I mean, how can anyone feel self-sufficient? In any place, at any time on this earth, there's sickness and death and poverty and rebellious children and typhoons, all kinds of things happening, wars. So for an individual to feel completely self-sufficient and worship nothing is just silliness. It's almost impossible unless he's demented. You might find it in the insane asylum, but not in normal life. But he might talk himself into worshiping collective mankind. Man with a capital M becomes the God. And man can do anything collectively. Even if some die, others will take their place. And it just occurred to me, in such a culture, you can't make too much to do about someone dying. Because the whole idea is it's collective mankind. No individual is important, and others will fill the gap. If a brick breaks, you get upset, the rabbi said, the Tower of Babel. Man dies. Be another guy. So the Tower of Babel, in my opinion, is still not idolatry, but it's the worship of man, by man, of man. It's collective man, worship by man. And to make it collective, you can't have individuality. Anyway, they all have to speak the same language. They all have to have the same names. They all have to wear the same clothing. They all have to eat the same food for Shabbos. It strikes a familiar chord. And of course, when you make people do that, when you stop them from thinking and feeling for themselves, no matter how well you pay them, the guy gets married in a poor country and he gets an apartment. Incredible. Never earned it. People who gave it to him never earned it. So now they're able, at this stage in the economic life of the Orthodox Jewish community, to schnorr an apartment. As they have more and more children in Mitzvah Hashem, unless there's a sudden proliferation of very, very rich Haredi people, they won't be able to get the boys' apartments. The prices are going up. But all right, you get this, and you get taken care of, you just live to learn, and you get a salary, maybe not so much, but it's a nice life in a way. There's only one price you have to pay. You can't be different. If you're different, you don't get your apartment, you don't get your kollel salary. And then you got to struggle with life. That escape from freedom gets paid, but the price is very high. And it's my contention that what we saw last week, to our great sadness on Shabbos, the riots were on Shabbos, public riots in Jerusalem, with stones and cinder blocks, people getting hurt, and policemen and newspapermen having to work on Shabbos. That this all comes, even though the Badatz put on their signs urging everyone to do this, not to throw anything. But when you have people who are so innately frustrated, males, there were no females apparently in those riots. It said in the newspaper just males. And young males, I would assume mostly. When you have young males who basically are at the heat of energy and vitality, and they are so constrained, they must find a legitimized target for that violence. Be it the young Hamas advocate or the young Badatzian, whoever it is, they must find it. All right? So we have, that's the Tower of Babel phenomenon. One language, one speech. God's response, the first thing is, he's got to set them against each other. Split up their languages, scatter them. No longer will there be just the village Israel, but there will also be Shas and Degel HaTorah. And God scatters them in all directions and confuses their language. And in the course of fighting each other or differing, they may recover their individuality. Still no idol worship. And I submit that idol worship isn't the worst thing in the world, even though a Jew is supposed to die for it. Because the rabbis say in the Gemara that idol worshippers outside of Israel don't make so much money because they really need to worship God. But it's the Avodah Zarah, a strange form of worship. All right, that's what we call it. Or Elohim Achirim, other powers. And it occurred to me a little while ago, maybe why it's called other gods. Let's say I worship the sun. What is really wrong maybe with worshiping the sun? I mean, it is a magnificent creation of God. Magnificent. It's something really beyond me. And according to the Rambam, and you won't go to hell if you don't believe this, but the Rambam says that they have feelings and thoughts and so forth, the astral bodies. The Rambam places the astral bodies in between people and angels. That they're higher than people, but lower than angels. It's in the Yesodei HaTorah. It says they have thoughts and feelings and so forth. Not free will, probably. And this even got put into the Siddur. Does anyone know where? You all sing it every Shabbos, that wonderful hymn which gives the latecomers time to catch up. While everybody is singing Yel Adon, the latecomers can catch up with the whole Dali while they're singing Yel Adon. And of course they give more space to Yel Adon than they give to Shema Yisrael and Shmon Esrei. Funny religion. But that El Adon prayer, Yitzaram B'Dev Avidu Vaskel, Rav Soloveitchik explained, not that God, with his intelligence of being made them, but God endowed them. It's from the 8th century Gaonim, approximately, the prayer El Adon. And apparently it reflects this kind of notion of the Rambam and some of the ancient Greek philosophers, that there is mind and intelligence and feelings, perhaps, to the astral bodies. Not the Samchim. Not that they make us happy when they go back and forth. They're happy. They're really enjoying it. It's like a beautiful thing to do, to be a son and walk all over the world, have the world go around and you set again, whatever. So we have this notion. So worshiping the sun isn't so bad, maybe, except what's wrong with worshiping the sun? No, what's with the moon? What's with the stars? Why discriminate against them? They're also wonderful. And then, if you're ready thinking of them, think of the caterpillar, think of the butterfly, think of the tree. Well, needless to say, Elohim Acherim, I'm trying to suggest that maybe it means that the problem is there's still Acherim. That with this Elohim you've picked, there's still Acherim whom you haven't picked. And if you're worshiping God through His creation, there's so much in the creation, you can't possibly get the right picture of God unless you worship the entire creation. But what's wrong with worshiping the entire creation? Spinoza or something. What's wrong with it is you can't know the entire creation. And even if by some miracle you've seen everything under the seas and everything on top of the mountains and every bird, which is impossible. Well, let's even say it happened, but to see what they really are. How can you worship the bird without knowing all about ornithology and all its inner structures? How can you worship a drop of seawater without looking under a microscope and seeing everything that's in that seawater and understanding it? And of course, science isn't finished. So therefore, trying to worship God through nature and still say He's Echad, you'd have to include everything in His nature. And it's impossible. So the only way is then to worship God as a totality is to worship God as the source of all nature. And by hooking up with Him, you hook up with the basic element behind everything. In other words, we try to get more and more basic units, things like atoms and molecules, which was the basic unit maybe a little while back in history. Now, that's already gross concepts. You have much more refined things that people are looking for and looking at. Yeah.
In Gematria, it's Elohim.
86, which is Hateva.
Hateva.
Right, 86.
Yes. So how do you correct it?
Thank you. I didn't bring it in today. I don't know why. We're very nice. Elohim Acherim, you are worshiping Teva, basically.
Yeah.
And Acherim, there's always Acherim. This is something that just occurred to me. It's an interesting idea. Whether it fits the words or not, the idea makes sense. So we have to get to the ultimate matter, which is behind everything, and which is the essence of everything, howbeit disguised in different packages and colors. And that's Hashem's essence. Not Elohim, Hateva, but Hashem, Yud-Kei, which is Netzach, which is eternal and non-physical, infinite, loving, relational, the soul, whatever adjectives you want to try to use to a little bit get the feeling of it. In creation, Hashem doesn't appear, only Elohim. When God addresses man, it's Hashem. To try to bring those two together. The seeming impersonal God of nature, we don't feel any warmth or love or affinity in the laws of science. Be it at Sonic or Russia, you throw off the leaning tower of Pisa, he falls at the same rate based on gravity and so forth. It's rather sad. Yet we proclaim in our highest moment of the year when we're closest to God. What's that moment? When are we in Kippur? At the very end, I would say it's the moment we're closest to God all year. And what do we say? Sammy is Samuel. Hashem hu Elokim, 7 times. 7 days of nature. Hashem hu Elokim, our separation. But that same Elokim, the seemingly impersonal giver of the laws of nature, is also Hashem, the infinite loving being, who is the root of, who is not physical and the root of everything. Yeah. That's less than Hashem hu Elokim. That's grand. That's the grandest statement of the year. More than Shema Yisrael even maybe. We say it more times anyway. And that's also Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. The God of infinity is our Lord of nature. We're the first people to show the world, as Mamlechet Kohanim, the Goy Kadosh, that they're not irreconcilable. That the world, as it really was before man messed it up, somehow had the essence of Hashem in every aspect of nature also. It wasn't a nature which was hostile to man, that's the curse already. That it'll yield thorns and thistles and it'll fight back. No, it was a nature that was friendly to man. And we could see God in everything. Okay? So, with this introduction of mine, we then really don't see Avodah Zarah until maybe, all right, we have all these stories about Abraham, maybe. I can even interpret Abraham now. I'm trying to get rid of Avodah Zarah, not just in the land of Israel, but in the Tanakh. Not like the Midrashim and not the Spy Idols. Abraham builds an altar every place he goes. Vayikra b'Shem Hashem, and he calls and proclaims the name of Hashem, not Elohim. So I would say everybody knew about Elohim from the time of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Yafes, and their descendants. But they didn't somehow see that I could relate to God, I could relate to God, that it was meaningful. It was just an impersonal God of nature who you had to be on good terms with. You had to be a good Vermonter to know which way the winds are blowing. Noah I called a good Vermonter. Eto Elokim is Noah, not Hashem. That's Noah. He's something, fine, but not transcendent. So the first, the real Avodah Zarah we have, probably Mizrahi. There God says, I will make judgment. Let's now go to the end of the novel, or at least the end of the first part. In Egypt, God clearly says, I will do judgment not just on Egypt, but upon its gods. The whole Mitzrayim, as said it was, I don't remember the exact language. So at that point, at least, in Egypt, we see idolatry. Of course, when the Jews come out, they're told to avoid the Canaanites and Egyptians because they're full of idols. At what point between Noah and the going out of Egypt, or coming into Egypt, did the people go off is not so clear from the text of the Bible. Obviously, they went off at some point. It's not like the anthropology of religion. Everybody was with God. When Noah's 3 sons were standing around, there was a great korbanot, and they went through the flood, they knew about God. They were like at a level we couldn't dream of closeness to God. So at some point it goes off, and it's not clear. So in our tradition, that point is identified. Does anyone know what it is?
Moses of Kaufman.
Oh, he knows.
And he said what you said.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I just thought of this today. I thought of it now. Rambam, we have a history of Avodah Zarah. It's in Rambam's Hilchot Avodah Zarah. And according to the Rambam, the critical point where they went off was actually fairly early in the game. According to the Rambam, it was in the time of Enosh. And he derives it from one word in the Torah. Bimei Enosh, Tov and Adam, I'll read it in English. During the times of Enosh, mankind made a great mistake, and the wise men of that generation gave thoughtless counsel. So the Rambam's trickled-down theory of religion, if you read the introduction to the Mishnah, he says the whole world only exists because of the one wise man who appears every generation or two. And the rest of the people aren't really worthy of living. They haven't fulfilled their function. That's what the Rambam says. It's very elitist, as we'll see. But if there was nobody to take out the garbage, wise man couldn't be a wise man. He had to do his own cooking and sewing. So all the other people, according to the Rambam, exist for the one great tzaddik chacham who lives every generation. That's his first theory. Practical. His second theory is much more interesting. Not practical, but interesting. He said, If all the idiots weren't around, the wise man would go crazy. Because even a wise man needs company. And if a person is alone, they can't remain mentally sound. So those are the two theories of the Rambam, why God bothers to create types who won't eventually be that one person every generation or two who really does it right. So according to him, the wise man, he stresses this because he has such a society. It's not a democracy. And the wise men of that generation gave thoughtless counsel. Enosh himself was among those who made a mistake. What was their mistake? What we mentioned before. They said God created stars and spheres with which to control the world. But the One High gave them great honor, great power, making them servants and minister before him. Accordingly, it's proper to praise and glorify them and to treat them with honor. And they thought this is what God wants. It's reasonable that they magnify and honor those whom he magnified and honored. God gave the stars and moon and sun a fantastic role in this universe. So I should, like God, give them a fantastic role in my universe of worship. It's not so unreasonable. Okay. Just like a king desires that the servants who stand before him be honored. Bush will be insulted if Gushamuni throws a tomato at Baker. Indeed, doing so is an expression of honor to his king. If I honor Baker, I'm honoring Bush. After conceiving of this notion, they began to construct temples to the stars and offer sacrifices to them. So this is not the evolution of religion, as the anthropologist of religion would have it. It's not the evolution of man, but the devolution of man. And you can spell it two ways, D-E-V-I-L or D-E-V-O-L. So we now have devolution or devolution of man in the time of Enosh. And they would praise and glorify the sun and moon and stars with words, bow before them, because by doing so they would, according to their false conception, be fulfilling the will of God. Not concentrating on God himself, but what would they say? We want the sun to come out now. We want the moon now. We want the stars now. I mean, it's a little funny thing in Jewish religion, which is more involved with Mashiach and the Rebbe than with God. Very strange. And I would make a parallel to exactly what I'm expressing. Good intentions. They worship that which God has honored. Shia, Rebbe, Talmud Chacham. But you can over-Jew it. And that's what happens. And I'd say, while many people are shouting, we want the Shia now. Other Talmidei Chacham, why don't they await God? Of course they want the Shia. The Shia is the way it's going to happen. But that's not the stress. That's not the end. And never forget, Genesis Rabbah 98, paragraph 9, that the Mashiach doesn't come to teach the Jews at all. Mashiach just comes to talk them into Aliyah, a sign that's not such an easy thing, via satellite television or something. Then once the Jews make Aliyah, and most Jews are here, God does miracles, fireworks, and God himself appears to the Jews. And then the Mashiach's job is to teach the Gentiles. Like first time around, they didn't want to learn from Moses. This time they learned from the Mashiach. First time around, the Jews weren't interested in learning from God. This time they learned directly from God. That's Genesis Rabbah 98:9. So they didn't really do anything so terrible, but it led to terrible things. Because by doing so, they would, according to their false conception, be fulfilling the will of God. And this was the essence, the worship of false gods. And this was the rationale of those who worship. They were very God-involved people, probably much more than us today. They would not say there is no other God except for this star. But they recognize God, and he wants us to worship all these things he made. And that's what Yirmiyahu says, who will not fear you, king of the nations, for you it is fitting. Among all the wise men of the nations and all their kingdoms, none like you. They have one foolish and senseless notion. They conceive of their empty teachings as wood, as something solid. All know that you alone are God. Their foolish error consists of conceiving of this emptiness as your will. That's how the Rambam interprets Jeremiah. So that's the first paragraph in the Rambam. If man starts out by not worshiping God directly, but by overly stressing some of his intermediaries. And as I pointed out before, it must be some, because no man knows the whole world. And therefore, you're automatically leaving out even part of God's creation, leave alone the worlds beyond creation. Fine. After many years passed, many years, because again, I point out, you don't see Avodah Zarah in the Torah. Arose people, false prophets, who told them they're still connected to God, remember. That God had commanded them to say, serve this star, or all the stars. Sacrifice to it, offer libations to it, build a temple for it, and make an image of it, so that all people, including the women, the children, the common people, could bow to it. Even in form of a form he could see. Again, I point out the problem of worshiping disciples. It's not always there. So if someone can't take abstraction, can't take the God She'ein Lo Demu Tayvu, who has no physical property, you can't see him, smell him, hear him, touch him, or see him. If someone wants a God which is more tangible, nature will not serve the bill because nature is transient, all aspects of it. Once you get to, so we got this new improved thing where he knows when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake, he knows whether you're good or bad, something good for goodness sake, the Santa Claus, whatever image is made of goodness. So he would tell them of a certain form or shape he made up, and that this is the image of that star. I mean, who knows what that telescope said. Claiming that this was revealed to him in a prophetic vision, all from God. In this manner, the people began to make images in temples, on the trees, on the tops of mountains and hills. People would gather together and bow down to them. And the false prophets would say, the image is the source of benefit or harm. Now, it's not just that the image is the way I worship the sun when I can't see the sun. The image itself has a power. The cross or the Buddha or whatever, or the picture of a certain man on the wall, whatever. It's appropriate to serve it and fear it. Their priests would tell them, this service will maybe you multiply, be successful. Do this and this, and don't do this and this. Subsequently, other deceivers arose and said a certain star, spirit angel, had spoken to them. Not God already spoke to them. Because the way the people are Mashiach oriented, are Rebbe oriented, are Rosh Hashiva oriented, but much worse, they're star, sun, image oriented. So then already we forget about God. He said, the star now told me this, says the phony fundamentalist preacher. Serve me in this manner. He would tell them something to do. Do this, don't do this. And thus these practices spread throughout the world. People would serve images with strange practices, one more distorted than the other, offer sacrifices to them, bow down to them. As the years passed, God's glorious and awesome name was forgotten by the entire human race. It was no longer part of their speech or thought, and they no longer knew it. Thus all the common people, the women and the children, this is the Rambam. Rambam's view of woman intellectually was very low. And that's a separate subject. We discussed it last week, but this is one place, Perikal, Deus Avodah Zarah 2. Okay. But the question is, how much is the Rambam some sort of statement of the innate nature of women? Or is it just because in his society, in Spanish society, women, or Egyptian society probably even more so, women were kept extremely uneducated and ignorant. So this is always a problem when we get statements of this sort in the rabbis. What comes from the Torah tradition and what comes from the secular life which they led? It's very hard to separate. You can't ignore the problem. The Rambam's son, the introduction to Yaakov, says that we are commanded to follow Chazal in everything pertaining to the Torah. They're the masters, they have the tradition from Sinai. We are also commanded not to follow them and not to believe them in secular matters, because that's not part of the Torah. And they have no authority in those. And the Rambam's son notes that when the rabbis thought the Greeks were right, they were wrong in a scientific matter, they said so. They weren't worried about the honor of the Torah because it has nothing to do with the Torah. This is not part of the Torah. So at least this is one mainstream way of looking at things, which solves a lot of problems. So when we get a statement involving assessments of the nature of the world or people or anything, you have to really explore it to see. As I asked Reb Salvation, can you give me a list? He said, of course this is true. I said, can you give me a list of those things to Gemara which are secular? He laughed. I mean, that's all you can need to have a demonstration that makes the Route 1 look like nothing in Boston. They come up from New York in buses. But anyway, but this is an issue. What is truly Chazal? What is it? For example, when I was researching for this past week's Parsha sheet, I have some of you didn't get it. The question of racism in Judaism. How do we look at black people? This is the Cedric Noah, where Canaan or Ham is cursed, and the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa City, God cursed them to be slaves. So how does Judaism look at it? So I'm asking around, and one quite learned rabbi, Thomas Hashem, says, well, the Rambam says the black is in between an animal and a human being. Really? This sounded interesting. I said, give me the source. He says, more in the Bukhum somewhere. So I go to the indexes. This is the sort of thing that they like to put in the indexes usually. So you have to really look for it. But in the modern edition, Professor Peters, I found it. He has it listed under details. And I look, it's chapter 51 of the third part of Morning Bukhum. And the Rambam has a beautiful story. I told it to my children. It's really a nice story. He says, picture a king in his palace. And the palace is surrounded by a little town. And there's a wall around the town, and a moat, and then there's the countryside. And people selling stuff right outside the walls, then you get into the real country. So he says, in this world, people are at different positions vis-a-vis the king and the palace. Some of the people, they don't even think about the palace and the king, because they're way out there in the country tending their flocks. Others are a little closer to the city wall, and they sense there's something going on inside. Some are inside the city, and they know already there's a palace. Some are actually in the palace. Some have been in, and very few actually have an audience with the king. He says those guys outside in the country are like the Turks in the north, and the blacks in the south, and other characters like them among us, who are sort of halfway between animal and man. They virtually have not developed their subnormal human divine image. That's the passage. Does the Rambam say blacks are like animals? No, absolutely not. Because then he would say the blacks in the south and Turks in the north and people like them among us. He's not speaking of the fact that they're black. He's citing certain black tribes and certain Turkish tribes which lived in a very, very sensual, animal, primitive fashion. Otherwise, he would say the South, he'd say the blacks. Very simple, it's so simple. And also, where did the Rambam live when he wrote the Word of the Bukhum? No. He wrote the Word of the Bukhum. Egypt. In Egypt, there's plenty of blacks. He doesn't have to say like the blacks way down in the South. Plenty of blacks around here. So it's obvious the Rambam is just pointing a certain group. But again, if someone doesn't really read the text carefully before dealing with such issues, they can jump to quite erroneous conclusions. But then, guess what? I did find a statement that blacks are halfway between animals and people. They're a species in between humans and animals. Can anyone guess who said it? It wasn't the Rambam.
Toynbee.
Huh?
Toynbee.
You're getting closer. Voltaire. So it occurred to me, yes, of course, he's a secularist. Secularists will do anything. Abraham says, hey, you're a Tashem of Malcolm Hazet. They'll kill me. They'll take my wife by the high civilization with its culture and music. The Austrians and Germans with Beethoven and Bach will make a Holocaust. Sure, Voltaire would say it. Because if you believe in evolution, and that man's just an accidental evolution of animals, well, you could say there's stages. Some are animals, some are half humans, some are full humans. Voltaire could say it, Rambam could say it. But Selam Elohim, we all come from Adam, we all have God, one Father. The Torah leads us to the opposite conclusion, that races are some kind of environmental accidents over a course of time, but ultimately, and the Rambam is the very one who doesn't differentiate between the soul of a Jew or the soul of a Gentile. It's all one human soul. And the Rambam, he's the one of the Arian, the Kabbalist, with the reincarnations and everything, also postulates souls of Jews and souls of Gerim and souls of Gentiles and all kinds of different souls. Rambam is not the same. But I'll just give you a couple of illustrations of how we cannot help, and we should look for, issues of the day in rabbinic writings. And at the same time, how careful we must be to distinguish what is the holy part and what is the secular part. And thirdly, how careful we must be to make sure we're very careful in examining what are they really saying, and not just jump to a conclusion.
So for us, we begin to think of idolatry in another word, another expression. What is that other word?
There's Avodah Zarah and Elohim Acherim. So I'm trying to say this is all corrupted forms of the worship of God. And the rabbis say don't laugh at idolaters outside of Israel, because they're struggling, they're groping to somehow objectify, to somehow focus on all these powers beyond them. If you're in Israel, with a Beit HaMikdash and a Mamlechet Kohanim B'Goy Kadosh, a king of a priest, the holy nation, Exodus 19:6, and you don't pick up the vibes, and you don't sense the abstract God, then you're to belay. But outside of Israel, what can we expect from you? You watch soap and Dynasty and all this stuff. We can't expect you to be a great spiritual or intellectual person. And even sometimes, in flirting with modern culture, there's dangers. The founders of the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement. By the way, I have to tell you the gematria, because it's important as an illustration of the powers of gematria. Which is the group of the world that most spreads Torah propaganda? Chabad, I would say so. More than any of the other big movements. And they go all over. And what's their motto? Ufaratzta. The word of the Torah, you shall spread forth. You have a game on some other bank law. Faratzta is in gematria, say what up. How much is Faratzta? The U is irrelevant. And Faratzta, you shall spread forth. Faratzta in gematria is how much? Pei is 80, Resh is 200, Sadi is 90, Top is 400. Let's do it slowly. Faratzta. 80 and 200 is 280. Sadi is 90, makes 370. And Top is 400, makes 770. Well, everyone knows that 770 is another name for Chabad. Isn't that magnificent? God hints in the Torah that the spreading forth shall be done by Chabad. But wait, be a little more careful. This is not my own. Guy who's in the Torah says a Faratzta, you'll have a cave that's above the neck, 4 ways. So that it's not just to be a one line spreading forth, but a broad spreading forth everywhere. So the real gematria of whoever it is who spreads forth things should be 4 times Faratzta. What is 4 times 770? Anyone? That's 2,800 and 280 makes 3,080. Does anyone know the significance of the number 3,080? It's the address of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America on Broadway. So, I'll leave it at this. So you see, you could do almost anything with gematria that proves nothing. Or maybe it does prove something. Who knows what God wants. So, the reason I bring that up is I happened this week to read the biography of Louis Ginsburg, who was a great, great scholar, maybe one of the greatest of the age, who wrote Legends of the Jews, published by JPS, all the footnotes. One of the greatest communists in the world, probably. He learned in Telz, he learned in Slovakia. He's descendant of the Villanova. And one of the founders of the Grand Faratzta, 3080 Broadway, at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He spent his whole life teaching. Funny man. In the book, his colleague, Professor Marx, great librarian and Jewish historian, asked him if they came to America, he didn't know these things, but we allowed to use the elevator on Shabbos. So Ginsburg does a whole research and tells him no. Then he sees Ginsburg getting in the elevator on Shabbos. He says, what are you doing? He says, I never asked a question. But anyway, funny sort of person. The book was very intriguing, but his son who wrote the book, Eli Ginsburg, who was a great economist and political thinker, really great man. His son says, we were 13 children of the early scholars of the seminary who decided to make a modern, non-traditional approach, criticism and so forth. 13 children. Of the 13 children, these people were all really great Jewish scholars. Halavai Rosh Yeshivas should know what they know. But not one of the 13 children went into Jewish scholarship. I was thinking if you would take 13 Rosh Yeshivas with all their deep faults, you'd probably have a fair number of their children becoming Rosh Yeshivas. Interesting. Of that first class, 2 went insane, of the children of these people. And the others achieved very fine, nice professions. And I'm sure they're probably pretty good Jews. Yeah, it's interesting. The book itself was fascinating, seeing how Judaism evolved. Because they started out as basically an Orthodox group. Drachman, Jastrow, and we all used the Hertz torch. Rabbi Hertz from England. Rabbi Hertz is one of the first graduate students to go to Interesting. Like it started out quite a pretty religious bunch. And again, for years, this fellow Ginsburg fought having mixed seating in the synagogues. Everything was just fine. But it's interesting how things start and where they lead to. Anyway, I recommend the book highly. So, back to where we're at with the Avodah Zarah. Oh yeah, that's why I brought it. So, they start out with something that seems very nice, actually. Let's really focus on God's words and honor them and praise them. But once they departed from that pure, solid truth of relating to God beyond anything in nature, so little by little, they went downhill until they found themselves in the end doing all kinds of crazy, meaningless worship to all kinds of crazy, meaningless symbols. And that's what happens. Where does Superman come in this terrible crisis? It's time for Batman or Superman or something. And he even says the Rambam, they were in such bad shape that the wise men among them would think there's no God, other than the stars and spheres, for whose sake and resemblance of which they had made these images. The eternal rock was not recognized by anyone in the world, with the exception of a few individuals. For example, Hanoch, Methuselah, Noah, Shem, Aver. The world continued in this fashion until pillar of the world, patriarch Abraham was born. After this mighty man was weaned, 3 years old or ever, 2 years old, he began to explore and think. By the way, the Rambam using this expression after he was weaned. The Rambam is our best source for biography of Abraham. He collected all the Midrashim, all the Talmudic passages, and wove them together here. This weaning is something, again, like the issue of race and a number of other things, which people generally ignore in the usual Torah world. We have a clear verse that Abraham made a big party, not the day of Yitzchak's bris or bar mitzvah, but of his weaning. And it's awfully hard to find in Orthodox Jewish society today any equivalent of that. We make a bris, we make a bar mitzvah, we make a wedding. Some people make a bat mitzvah.
Perhaps he wasn't weaned until he was 3 years old.
Fine, so why don't we do the same thing? You can say simply we don't have a moment of weaning. Well, some people do. Let's take that's fact A. Let's take fact B, a very strange, perhaps superstitious Jewish custom of not cutting little kids' hair until they're 3 years old. They have luck or something that hurt them. And then turning the 3-year-old haircut into a religious ceremony. My guess would be that the latter is a substitute for the former. That there was a tradition you make a party at 3 years old or so when they will leave. And it's a great celebration. But they stopped weaning in such a definitive fashion. And they had to find something else. So that this whole thing arose maybe out of some kind of superstition. I don't know. In other words, I don't know of any halachic or Torah source for a view of a 3-year-old haircut. I hope it is. The fact that it has a Yiddish name already makes me suspicious instead of the Hebrew name as to where it comes from. I don't know. But in asking my pupils in previous years, I had some very nice people from Germany back when the Israel started before the Inquisition. And they told me they had them, by the Germans. Reb Soloveitchik always said the Germans had the oldest, finest Ashkenazi tradition. And he said the German people in many places, they make something called a wimple. When the kid's 3 years old, they embroider a beautiful piece of cloth to use to wrap the Torah. They bring the kid to shul, right, and everything. Huh? It's the real diaper. So they wash it well. I mean, I don't like that he didn't Yaakov and Sefer Torah. She did mention that. I learned something new. I wonder if every place was the diaper. Wow, that's incredible. I mean, it says, Mizrahi lion urine would be suitable for making the incense. We read it in the prayers every day. But they said they didn't use Mizrahi lion because it's not chudat, it's not honorable. Of course, this is already washed. It's not that.
I'm sure they
Oh, it's the same napkin from the book. Diaper. Right, but he's gone to another stage, and now I can wrap the Torah. Little Fisher's growing up or something like that. I don't know quite the... I have a hunch, a psychoanalyst. I find that whole thing very interesting. But, all right, that's good to know. Anything else you can tell us about the way? Well, she brought one to the class. It was quite beautiful, actually. Beautifully embroidered. When he got married, they used it to make the kickle or something. It was already dedicated for the sacred Torah. Funny religion. But none of that is as strange as little red strings. Okay. Anyway, probably an Arab custom. Because I don't think it was prevalent in the rest of the world, just in Israel. Okay. After this mighty man was weaned, and what's the significance of the weaning party? This Rambam tells you, why do you make such a fuss when Yitzchak's weaned? Because when you're at the age of weaning is when you're not just the mother who gives you your soul essence, as we discussed last week, who gives you the essence of Hashem, not Elohim. The infinite essence makes you Jewish. But now it's Father's turn to do the thing of Elohim, of conquest of the world, of training you intellectually. So Avram rejoiced that once he's weaned from mother, it's time for the male function of teaching his child. And just like Avram himself, as the Rambam says, you see, after this mighty man was weaned, he began to explore and think. Though he was a child, he began to think incessantly throughout the day and night, wondering, how is it possible for the sphere to continue to revolve without having anyone controlling it? Who is causing it to revolve? Doesn't it revolve itself? He had no teacher, nor was there anyone else to inform him. Rather, he was married or accustomed to all the foolish idolaters. His father, his mother, and all the people around him were idol worshippers, and he would worship with them. However, you don't suddenly change overnight. You start thinking, you start feeling. His heart was exploring and gaining understanding. Ultimately, he appreciated the way of truth and understood the path of righteousness through his accurate comprehension. He realized there was one God that controlled the sphere. They created everything. There's no other God among all the other entities. You know, the entire world was making a mistake. What caused them to err was their service to the stars and images, which made them lose awareness of the truth. They stopped thinking. They stopped feeling for themselves. This takes a long time. He starts about 3. Avram was 40 years old when he became aware of his Creator. Then, when he gets a little more confident, he begins not just lilmod, but lamed. When he recognized and knew him, he began to formulate replies to the inhabitants of poor custom and debate with them, telling them they're not following proper path. And then he became an activist. He broke their idols, began to teach the people it's fitting to serve only God. To him alone it's fitting to bow down and sacrifice not for libation, so that the people of future generations would recognize him. Conversely, it's fitting to destroy and break all the images, lest people give them power that they don't have, like those people who thought there were no other gods. When he overcame them through the strength of his arguments, the king, this is the Medrash, Nimrod, tried to kill him. He was saved through a miracle and left for Haran. And this explains why his father had to leave Ur Kasdim, the center of civilization, for primitive Haran along the Canaan border, because his son was a troublemaker. And he had to go out in the sticks somewhere where people didn't care so much, where the establishment wasn't so strong. Once he got to Haran, he began to call in a loud voice to all people, tell them there's one God in the entire world and it's proper to serve him. He would go out and call to them, gathering them in city after city, country after country, till they came to the land of Canaan. Like a Parsi sheep, just picture of it. Proclaiming God's existence the entire time. As Genesis 21:33 states, and he called there in the name of the Lord who turned us. The Rambam interprets it. There's 2 ways of interpreting that pasuk, which is coming up this coming week. Either Abraham prayed, or Abraham missionarized. Abraham proclaimed. The usual thing is a building up and proclaim God's name. The usual translation is like the Rambam here, that Avram was a great missionary. When the people would gather around him and ask him about his statements, he would explain to each of them according to their understanding, until they turned to the path of truth. Ultimately, thousands of myriads gathered around him. These are the men of the house of Abraham. He planted in their hearts this great fundamental principle, composed text about it, taught it to Isaac, his sons. Isaac taught others and turned their hearts to God. But we don't see him building altars and proclaiming. He also taught Jacob and appointed him as a teacher. Jacob taught others and turned the hearts of all those who gathered around him to God. Where the Rambam gets this from, I'm not so sure. He also taught all of his children. He selected Levi. This passage I always found very difficult, because we only see the choice of Levi later after the firstborn messed it up by the golden calf. But the Rambam says Levi was always special. He just didn't go publicly. And appointed him as the leader. He established him as the head of the yeshiva to teach them the way of God and observe the mitzvah of Abraham. And bear in mind, there were fine schools teaching about God and reality, what we call the Beit of Shem and Eber, where the Avot themselves learned all this time. Not Jews. Jacob commanded his sons the leadership should not depart from the descendants of Levi, that the teachings would not be forgotten. And the concept proceeded and gathered strength among his descendants and those who collected around them, until there became a nation in Egypt within the world which knew God. When the Jews extended their stay in Egypt, however, they learned from the Egyptians and began worshiping the stars as they did, the Egyptians, with the exception of the tribe of Levi, who clung to the mitzvahs of the patriarchs. The tribe of Levi never served those gods. Within a short time, the fundamental principle that Abraham had planted would have been uprooted, and the descendants of Jacob would have returned to the errors of the world and their crookedness. Because of God's love for us, and to uphold the oath he made to Abraham, our patriarch, he brought forth Moshe, our teacher, the master of all prophets, and sent him to redeem the Jews. After Moshe, our teacher, prophesied, and God chose Israel as his inheritance, he crowned him with mitzvahs and informed him of the path to serve him, teaching him the judgment prescribed for idol worship and all those who stray after. So we finished the first section, chapter 1, the basic overview of the Rambam's laws of idol worship. The old one is the Book of Knowledge. It's nice, but nothing much more than translation. And the newer and better one is Talmud, which is with loads of nice notes in it. It's really fun. He's got out about 10, 12 lines. So, just to summarize, and that's it, I think we reasonably explored idolatry for a one-shot lecture. And the message seems to be that we have to be in this world to get out of it. When the Jews worship the golden calf, God then gives the Mishkan, some say in compensation. That God picks things which can't be worshipped and must be worshipped, at least mustn't be. And those things, physical things, like the Mishkan, the Ark, the Sefer Torah, the altars, are to bring us out of the physical into a state where we worship God beyond those things. We go to the Mishkan or to the Beit HaMikdash, where God's presence dwells, not in it, but b'tocham in them. And once we've integrated into our personalities, then we don't need an external trapping to find it. It's there within us. And between the Torah and our own souls, Hashem Nasalam Torah Semesu has given us a Torah of truth. The Chai Olam and has also planted Chai Olam, eternal life in us, to get back to the Eitz HaChaim in the Garden of Eden. Between that, the Jewish people struggles throughout its history not to worship anything other than that God which can't be seen or felt or heard. And the rest of the world very strongly resists that message. We use mitzvahs now. We don't have a tabernacle or a temple. But eating kosher and Shabbat, all those physical acts mustn't become a fixation themselves that that's God. But that's also a means. It's the idea. It gives a little light. It's a ner, a candle. The ner mitzvah, the Torah law. But the ideas behind it are a vast light. And this is the test of the Jewish people. And we always have to be on guard in our days too, that the Jews themselves don't worship Eitz Be'er, a beautiful tech-built house of wooden glass on the Pacific Coast, a nice car without crazy taxes. Avodah Zarah, the Torah, this is the last point. The Torah says, funnily enough, God will send us in exile. We will worship there, wood and stone, the work of our hands. Rabbi Yaakov didn't ask, but we don't. Nice religious Jews, not kosher, Shabbat on Shabbos, they don't worship any idols. It says it means, again, as I explained at the beginning, taking any part of God's reality and trying to overemphasize and focus on that instead of all of God's reality, which must lead you to the God behind the reality. There's each culture, each nation where the Jews are, has some overemphasis. German exactness and punctuality, and perhaps a certain coldness. American pragmatism and overly enthusiastic and simplistic. British manners and politeness. French and Italian food and sensuality. Each culture contributes something. Basketball players and jazz and musicians from blacks in the South of the United States and so forth. But if the Jews pick up the overemphasis of that culture, it's like worshiping other gods. And then in a rational sense, now that God's bringing us all back, for some reason he picked us. After 1900 years, we're the ones who came back here. And we're all to blend. And by each of us blending with the others and having relationships, and we're to marry the Yemenite with the Yeki and so forth, we gradually will take all of these extremes and blend them so that the state of Israel, in a very irrational sense, will be a balanced model for the whole world. And then Ki Mitzil Tetzei Torah and Devar Hashem Yerushalayim. Just an announcement. At 8 o'clock tonight, Rabbi Riskin is speaking in the synagogue in Yemin Moshe at the bottom. As you stand at the windmill, it's in the lower left-hand corner of Yemin Moshe, the synagogue, on Pelio 8th Street, Bethel. And there will be every Sunday at 8 lectures there for the next month and a half or so. So you can come here, have supper, and then go there. Next week's subject will be the matriarchs. We spent all these years doing the patriarchs. And we just read about Abraham and Yitzchak. And the Rambam, who I think wasn't very enthused about women. That's the story that his mother died when he was born. His father hated them and his father hated his mother. It's in Shashat HaKabbalah. That whole society put down women as opposed to the Hasidim who turn the men into women sometimes. These gentle, sweet creatures. But anyway, women tend to get ignored. So I decided what we're doing next week. I'm trying to get a hold of Chaya Brand, the psychologist. Perhaps she'll do it with me herself. But one of us will do the matriarchs next week. Please tell people, because lately the free ads haven't been appearing in the post. Spread the word. There's partial.
That's what you got to say.